Mr. Moderator, we are ready when you are.
All right. Good evening, and thank you for joining the Arlington Democrats tonight as we host a roundtable on the proposed constitutional amendment on redistricting. My name is Praveen Main. I'm your host and moderator for this evening. On behalf of the Arlington Democrats, I would like to thank each of the panelists and their organizations for joining us. The Arlington Democrats has not taken a position on the proposed constitutional amendment on redistricting, but the committee expects to hear a motion presented in the coming days or months. We have gone to great lengths to ensure that the discussion is robust and balanced. While we understand that tonight's topic is one of much contention, I'd like to remind our speakers that we are all Democrats here tonight. We trust that you will uphold our democratic values throughout the duration of the evening. We will hear from our 6 panelists tonight. 3 of the panelists are in favor of the amendment, while 3 of the panelists oppose the amendment. We invite participants to list their questions in the chat box. If we have time at the end of the roundtable, we will take live questions. You may also see a few poll questions throughout the discussion tonight. We encourage you to participate. The Arlington Democrats invites all of the speakers tonight to join us for a Saturday morning mug to provide voters an additional opportunity to ask questions more directly. Tonight's discussion is being recorded and will be made available for later viewing. The panelists have also provided us with additional resources. Those resources will be disseminated after the discussion concludes. We encourage all participants to read through the resources and to reach out to our panelists following tonight's roundtable to more fully understand the amendment. A copy of the resources can be requested by emailing outreach@arlingtondemocrats.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to each of the 6 panelists for the evening. In alphabetical order according to last name, we are pleased to introduce them. Their bios are long, so we've tried to keep it brief. We will have more in-depth bios available later. Our first panelist is Senator Barbara Favola. Prior to her election to the state Senate, Senator Barbara Favola served on the Arlington County Board for 14 years and chaired that body 3 times. During her service with the county, Senator Favola was the board's leading advocate for children, youth, and families, and her contributions to the community including establishing mental health services in the public schools. Senator Favola is a whip in the Virginia Senate Democratic Caucus. She chairs the Senate Democratic Rehabilitation and Social Services Committee, as well as serving on local government committees, Local Government Committee, Transportation Committee, Rules Committee, Agriculture, Conservation, and National Resources Committee. She is a member and former chair of the Virginia Advisory Committee for Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence, chair of the Senate Women's Health Care Caucus, and a member and former chair of Virginia's Commission on Youth. Thank you, Senator, for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Our next panelist is Ms. Kathay Feng. Ms. Feng has led Common Cause's work to challenge partisan and incumbent gerrymandering through litigation, state-based organizing around ballot initiatives and legislation, and creating new platforms for community-based redistricting. As executive director of California Common Cause, she championed and won elections and redistricting reforms, stronger government sunshine and accountability laws, campaign finance reforms, stronger net neutrality laws, and the voting rights of traditionally disenfranchised communities. Ms. Feng is an architect of California's Citizen Redistricting Commission, leading the multi-year effort to study, write, and pass the 2 initiatives. Propositions 11 and 20 that created the commission and new community-focused process. She also led efforts that secured passage of California's laws, bringing online voter registration and same-day registration, called conditional voter registration, to the state. Welcome, Ms. Feng. Our next panelist is Mr. Luke Levasseur. Mr. Levasseur is a commercial litigator with the DC office of a large law firm. He represented the federal government as an attorney with the Civil Division of the United States Department of Justice from 1997 to 2006. He served as lead counsel for, or had a significant role during the trial and appeal of, several large cases that were part of the Windstar-related litigation, which involved billions of dollars in claims against the government and were based on legislative and regulatory changes in the financial services industry. Mr. Levasseur has also been active in Democratic Party politics for several years. Among other activities, he has served as vice chair of the Drainesville District Fairfax County Democratic Committee, and he is a co-leader of Virginia Democracy Forward, a progressive grassroots organization. Good evening, Mr. Levasseur. Our next panelist is Delegate Mark Levine. Delegate Levine is currently in his 3rd term, serving the 45th District in the House of Delegates, which includes South Arlington, Eastern Alexandria, and parts of Fairfax County. A progressive champion for free and fair elections, he serves on the House Privileges and Elections Committee. In the 2020 session, he introduced both a constitutional amendment and legislation to end gerrymandering in Virginia, and he introduced and passed numerous bills to make Virginia elections fairer, including bills to repeal voter ID requirements, to decide tied elections by special elections rather than picking a piece of paper out of a bowl, to require voter verification paper ballots, and to make the process for recounts fairer. His House Bill 177, which would have had Virginia join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, passed the House this year, but was continued to next year by the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee. He also introduced a campaign finance reform bill to tie the limit on personal campaign contributions for state elections to the federal limit. We are pleased to have Delegate Levine join us tonight. Our next panelist is Delegate Don Scott. Delegate Scott is an attorney, former United States naval officer, and community leader. Originally from Houston, Texas, Delegate Scott graduated from Texas A&M University. After completing his undergraduate education, he joined the United States Navy, where he served as a surface warfare officer. Following his naval career, Delegate Scott obtained his law degree from Louisiana State University. In 2015, the delegate fulfilled a lifelong dream and founded the law office of Don Scott. He has represented over 1,000 clients fighting for justice. He is chair of the Portsmouth Economic Development Authority and serves as the first vice chair of the Southeastern Employment and Training Association. Delegate Scott is a member of the Eureka Club and holds lifetime memberships in the NAACP and VFW Post 993. In the past, he has served as chair of the National Association of Workforce Development Professionals and served on the board of the California Workforce Association and 200 Plus Manhattan Roads, among others. In 2019, Delegate Scott was elected to the Virginia State Assembly. He currently represents the 80th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. Thank you for being with us this evening, Delegate Scott.
Thank you for having me.
Our final panelist is Mr. Bobby Vassar. Mr. Vassar has cultivated a long career in the legal field and accumulated extensive experience in issues relating to justice policy and its implementation at the state and federal level. Mr. Vassar has worked in the public sector since 1976, most recently as chief counsel to the minority in the House Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Before that, he served as senior counsel and legislative director to Congressman Bobby Scott. Prior to working in Congress, Mr. Vassar served in various state offices in Virginia, including as acting secretary for Health and Human Resources, deputy commissioner for state programs in the Department of Social Services, and chairman of the Virginia Parole Board. He also served as president of the Association of Paroling Authorities in 1987 and is a member of the Virginia Criminal Sentencing Guideline Commission from 1995 to 2001. Mr. Vassar began his legal career as a fellow at the Roanoke Legal Aid Society. Mr. Vassar, thank you for your participation in our roundtable tonight.
Thank you, Praveen. Glad to be here.
Thank you to all our panelists for joining us. We'll now transition to an introduction and explain the current amendment as it stands. To ensure we are fair and balanced, we have asked two local Arlington Democrats to join us for these introductory remarks. Can the slideshow be shared? What is redistricting, you may ask? The current Virginia reapportionment process, the decennial drawing of the legislative districts following the census, is defined in the Virginia Constitution, Article 2, Section 6, as follows. Quote, members of the House of Representatives of the United States and members of the Senate and of the House of Delegates of the General Assembly shall be elected from electoral districts established by the General Assembly. Each electoral district shall be composed of continuous and compact territory and shall be so constituted as to give, as nearly as is practicable, representation in proportion to the population of the district. The General Assembly shall reapportion the Commonwealth into electoral districts in accordance with this section in the year 2011 and every 10 years thereafter. Any such decennial reapportionment law shall take effect immediately and not be subject to the limitations contained in Article 4, Section 13 of the Constitution. A census occurs in the United States every 10 years for all years ending with 0. Reapportionment, which is defined as the reassignment of representatives proportionally among the states in accordance with changes in population distribution. There are currently 435 congressional seats assigned to the states according to the census data. Based on the results of the census, each state draws new congressional districts and also draws new lines, which could be considered as boundaries for state legislature seats. In Virginia, we have 100 representatives in the House of Delegates, and we have 40 representatives in the Senate. A major critique of having a legislative body control the apportionment process is that legislators are incentivized to draw boundaries that advantage those already in office, as well as the ability for districts to be drawn in a manner that unfairly benefits one particular political party. There has been a large grassroots movement in Virginia for the past 5 years to implement an independent process for redistricting, which requires an amendment to the Virginia Constitution to alter Article 2, Section 6, and take the power of appointment away from the legislature as it currently lies. To amend the Virginia Constitution, a joint resolution must pass both chambers of the General Assembly in the same form in 2 consecutive years with an election in between. In 2019, Senate Joint Resolution 306 passed the House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate. House Resolution 615 also passed the House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate. Originally, the bills were different proposals for a redistricting commission, but they were made identical in a conference committee prior to passage. The General Assembly elections were then held in November of 2019, satisfying the need for an election between 2 consecutive years. The resolution was considered in the 2020 legislative session, where it also passed the House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate, placing it on the upcoming November 3rd, 2020 general election ballot for voters to now decide. The language that is being proposed on the ballot reads as following, quote, "Should the Constitution of Virginia be amended to establish a redistricting commission consisting of 8 members of the General Assembly and 8 citizens of the Commonwealth that is responsible for drawing the congressional and state legislative districts that will be subsequently voted on, but not changed by, the General Assembly and enacted without the governor's involvement, and to give the responsibility of drawing districts to the Supreme Court of Virginia if the redistricting committee fails to draw districts or the General Assembly fails to enact districts by certain deadlines," end quote. The proposed redistricting commission is comprised of 16 members, 4 members of the Virginia Senate, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, as well as 4 members of the Virginia House of Delegates, 2 Democrats and also 2 Republicans. 8 citizen members are selected by a panel of 5 retired circuit court judges. By November 15th of a year ending in 0, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Virginia will share a list of retired circuit court judges willing to serve on the selection panel. From the list, the following individuals will select a judge from the list: the Speaker of the House of Delegates, Minority Leader of the House of Delegates, President pro tempore of the Senate, Minority Leader of the Senate. The 4 judges selected will then select a 5th judge from the list provided by the Chief Justice. The Speaker of the House of Delegates, House Minority Leader, President pro tempore of the Senate, and Senate Minority Leader will each submit lists of at least 16 qualified citizen members. The selection committee then selects by majority vote 2 citizens from each list presented to them. This slide is a visual of how the 16-person commission would look if the amendment passes. Once convened, the commission is required to hold at least 3 public hearings in different parts of the Commonwealth. They will be required to select a chairperson from among the 8 citizen members. All records and documents of the commission would be considered public information, and the General Assembly would be able to vote yes or no on the maps, but would no longer be able to amend the maps. The commission would be required to submit to the General Assembly plans for districts for the Senate and House of Delegates no later than 45 days following the receipt of census data. For plans to be submitted, at least 6 of the 8 legislative members and 6 of the 8 citizen members must vote for the plan. The plan for the Virginia Senate must be approved by at least 3 of the 4 Senate representatives of the commission. The plan for the Virginia House must be approved by at least 3 of the 4 House of Delegates representatives. The commission would also be required to submit the General Assembly plans for the United States House of Representative districts no later than 60 days following the receipt of census data, or by the first day of July that year, whichever is later. For plans to be submitted, at least 6 of the 8 legislative members and 6 of the 8 citizen members must vote for the plan. There are federal prohibitions against drawing districts that disadvantage racial and minority ethnic groups, which is common ground for litigation challenging the redistricting process. Recently, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that districts drawn for the purpose of advancing a political party is constitutional. There is additional language in Senate Bill 717 that states that the maps shall preserve communities of interest, shall be composed of contiguous and compact territory, and that the maps shall not unduly favor or disfavor any political party. Incarcerated persons that are Virginia residents would be assigned to the last known home address. Non-residents would be assigned to the jurisdiction where the prison facility is located. There is a proposed amendment on the ballot for the November general election. Voters will vote yes or no. The amendment passes if it receives 50+1 vote of the majority of voters. It would become law on November 15th. If the amendment does not pass, redistricting will still occur using the current method described in the Virginia Constitution. The General Assembly will pass legislation governing the redistricting process. That legislation could include some of the elements from the proposed constitutional amendment, but might also differ substantially. As you can see, the decision rests in your hands as the voters of the upcoming election. We implore all of you on this call and to let everyone know that all voters will be able to vote in the upcoming general election. That brings us to why we have tuned in tonight. Tonight, we are here to learn from subject matter experts on whether or not the amendment should be passed. The Arlington Democrats has gone to great lengths to ensure the panel was balanced and fair. We will now transition to hear directly from our panelists. Each panelist will be given 5 minutes to provide a statement in support or against the proposed amendment and offer supporting details. I kindly ask that the panelists keep their opening statements to 5 minutes in length. If you are not a panelist or speaking, please mute yourself. Both sides are passionate, which is wonderful in democracy in action, but I ask that everyone be respectful of all viewpoints during the presentation and in the chat box. First up is Mr. Vassar. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Praveen. I am a member of the One Virginia 2021 board, and on behalf of the board, I'd like to thank Arlington Democrats, Mike, all who had a hand in putting this together, and the panelists for also participating. As a member of the One Virginia board, I served on its bipartisan committee to draft a constitutional redistricting reform amendment. Key elements of the constitutional amendment were drafted, that we drafted, were adopted in the current amendment. The problem we're seeking to address with a constitutional amendment is the dismal history of racial and partisan controlled gerrymandering and self-dealing by both Republican and Democratic legislators in Virginia. Under this system, politicians get to pick their voters rather than the other way around. Both Republicans and Democrats have voted for partisan-drawn redistricting maps for federal and state election districts that protected incumbents but were declared unconstitutional as racially gerrymandered. I'm a Democrat, and I'm fine with the way Democrats gerrymander districts to protect and elect Democrats. However, I know that Democratic partisan gerrymandering only begets Republican partisan gerrymandering. Although the U.S. Supreme Court has determined that partisan gerrymandering is allowable, that does not make it a good idea. As long as we have partisan control of redistricting, we run the risk of partisan gerrymandering. We deserve better and have provided for better in the current redistricting constitutional amendment that is twice passed the General Assembly on a strong bipartisan vote and is ready for citizen approval this November. This amendment is a good bipartisan product that provides a reasonable and workable compromise of ideas and approaches from national and state experts and conscientious, experienced, hardworking representatives of both major political parties, taking into account proving approaches from other states. Of major significance to me is the fact that the amendment provides for the first time a Virginia constitutional provision to protect minority voting rights. The language reads, districts shall provide, where practicable, opportunities for racial and ethnic communities to elect candidates of their choice, unquote. This protection will be there regardless of what happens with the Federal Voting Rights Act or U.S. Supreme Court interpretation of federal constitutionally guaranteed voting rights. The current amendment also provides for a citizen-chaired, fully bipartisan redistricting commission with equal citizen and legislative representation and full transparency in the electoral map drawing process. As with any constitutional provision, implementation or enactment legislation can be adopted to assure the provisions are carried out as intended, all of which will also be subject to court review. With a good amendment in hand, we should be leery of promises of a, quote, new and improved, unquote, amendment for 2031 in exchange for scrapping a twice-passed bipartisan 2021 amendment. In my 20 years of working with Congressman Bobby Scott and 12 years of working with the General Assembly as a cabinet official and agency head for 3 Virginia governors, I know that nobody can guarantee you what will come out of a legislative process. To be sure, this amendment is the only chance Virginia has for taking the control of the map drawing process from the partisan controlled legislature and governor's office before the 2031 redistricting. Anything other than the amendment leaves the matter in the control of the legislature and the governor. And we have seen what this has wrought in terms of racially gerrymandered and contorted districts to protect incumbents, requiring federal courts to have to draw Virginia's voting districts. Last year, the amendment was approved by 38 of the 40 senators and 83 of the 100 House members. Many of the members now speaking against the amendment, quote, were for it before they were against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vassar, for those remarks. Next, we'll have panelist Delegate Levine.
Thank you, Praveen. Thank you, Arlington County Democrats, for having me here. I used to work with Bobby Vassar in Congress 20 years ago. When he worked for Bobby Scott, I worked for Barney Frank. And I remember something his boss used to always say. He said, be careful of lipstick on a pig, because even if there's lipstick on it, it's still a pig. If you ask the leader of the Republicans in the House of Delegates, Todd Gilbert, he was asked recently, what was the pathway to Republican victory, Republican majority in the future? And he mentioned it was this amendment. In fact, he said it was, quote, really remarkable, unquote, that Democrats voted for this amendment. So what did Todd Gilbert know that hasn't yet been discussed? To mix metaphors, it's the cyanide on the ice cream, right? The ice cream tastes really good, but if there's cyanide on it, it really doesn't matter what flavor it is. All those wonderful graphs, all those wonderful pictures, the transparency, the citizens, all of that is wonderful, and it will all be thrown in the trash if Todd Gilbert wants it to be. The amendment has a poison pill put in there by Republican Mark Cole, and the poison pill goes like this. It says that if Republicans want to, the entire commission is dead, trash, meaningless. All those pretty words, all those pretty graphs, you don't have to remember them. All you have to know is what the bill says. So let's go into the details, because the details matter. We all want to prevent gerrymandering. I hate gerrymandering, but the one thing worse than gerrymandering is giving Republicans full control over the process. So what does the amendment say? I'm trying to share the screen here. Let's see if I got it right. Okay, so here's the amendment. It says that if 3 of the 4 legislative members who are members of the Senate don't want the commission, it dies. If 3 of 4 delegates don't want it, it dies. Doesn't matter how many citizens want it. If Todd Gilbert and Mark Cole say no, it dies. The commission is meaningless. All those wonderful provisions, transparency, out the window. Who decides? The 11 words that I've highlighted here are the entire amendment. The rest of it you can ignore. It says the district shall be established by the Supreme Court of Virginia. If Todd Gilbert, if the Republicans want it to, all those pretty things, all the lipstick, all the ice cream goes out the window, the Supreme Court decides. So what are their standards? It doesn't say. It just says the district shall be established by the Supreme Court of Virginia. Well, what about all that legislation that we just saw? Senate Bill 717, that sure sounds good. Sure it does, but it doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? Mark, it's the law. I know, I wrote some of it. It only matters if you say no to the amendment. Because if you say yes, the Constitution trumps a law. That's kind of basic law 101. The Virginia Constitution trumps Virginia law. So it doesn't matter all those pretty and wonderful provisions, some of which were in George Barker's original bill, because the poison pill put in by Republicans, the one that Todd Gilbert's so proud of, the one that Mark Cole is so proud of, kills the whole thing. Citizens out the window. There's no need to be transparency. There are no standards. There are no guardrails. George Barker admitted that to me when I quizzed him on the House Privileged Elections Committee. He said, yeah, the Republicans could gerrymander. There are no standards. It's not appealable, by the way, because it's the Virginia Supreme Court, which would have the first legislative power it's ever had. So it's not appealable to anyone. Certainly not appealable to the Supreme Court, because the United States Supreme Court has said you can politically gerrymander all you want. In fact, it's the US Supreme Court that said you can't racial gerrymander. So the fact that we have it in the amendment as well is kind of meaningless. We already can't do that, but they can still politically gerrymander. I think the solution is not to give full power to Republicans to decide all of Virginia's boundaries for decades to come. Who's on the Virginia Supreme Court? Every single one of them was appointed by the majority Republican legislature. So who are they? Well, you've got the sister of a sitting Republican senator, a former Republican senator and delegate. You got the right-hand man of Ken Cuccinelli. So if you trust Ken Cuccinelli, vote for this amendment. That's who's going to decide. No Democrats, not a single Democrat will have any power to draw any of these lines. Well, that's a poison pill if I've ever seen one. And it's not what Arlington voters wanted. If you look at the Arlington County District Committee, I'm going to try to pull this one up as well in my short time. If you look at the resolution that y'all passed back in 2019, and here it is, here it is. Supporting nonpartisan redistricting, it says that you want nonpartisan redistricting commission. And we can do that. You know how we do that? If you vote no on the amendment, we will get nonpartisan redistricting commission. I think every Democrat is on board is supporting this. Certainly I am, Delegate Scott is, Senator Barbara Viola is. We all support it. Everyone says the amendment's flawed. We can do better. And here's the best part. The Republicans will support it too. Once the amendment dies and they won't have full power over the process, they will support a process that allows Democrats and Republicans to together put in the nonpartisan redistricting commission that all of us wanted. So don't take the poison pill. My time is up. Please vote no on the amendment.
Thank you, Delegate Levine. We hope that any of you that don't get to make the points in opening statement, we will certainly be able to make them in the question and answer session a little bit later. We want to hear from all of you. Our next panelist will be Senator Favola. Senator Favola, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Praveen. I think I'm going to focus my comments in response to Delegate Levine's comments, just so everybody can follow the argument without having to jump back and forth. I certainly understand Delegate Levine's remarks, but I think there are 2 or 3 facts that we all need to consider when we're assessing the value of having a constitutional amendment in the Virginia Constitution. First off, an amendment is a far more permanent protection than any legislation. And as we debated on the floor of the Senate, whether we should go the amendment route or scrap it and try to come up with just legislation to create another commission to somebody's liking, at the end of the day, I was swayed by experts and by those who had been most disenfranchised in our voting system. And I know that the Black Caucus in the Senate stood firmly behind having this constitutional amendment. And their argument was the transparency that's in this amendment, the fact that there will be public input, the fact that half of the commissioners will be appointed by retired circuit court judges. There are guardrails to ensure openness, and therefore the extension of that would be good decision making. And of course, we went ahead and the criteria bill passed, which was patroned by Senator McClellan, and further outlines and gives guidance to the commission. We also had an enabling bill, which would have addressed some of the issues Delegate Levine pointed out. But that enabling legislation didn't pass because it's very complicated getting legislation through. A couple of things I want to leave the audience with. Delegate Levine is correct. If there is a deadlock on the commission, Then the General Assembly would make the decision on the lines, on the district lines. Under the Constitution, however, the constitutional amendment, if there's a deadlock, the Virginia Supreme Court will establish the district lines. In my view, I think there's far less risk of gerrymandering when you have a Virginia Supreme Court making the decision versus lawmakers who have a vested interest in how those lines are drawn. If you look at history and you look at the facts, the courts don't ever decide themselves on what redistricting lines will look like. They always turn to experts. Always. There isn't one case precedent where a court had actually, the judges rolled up their sleeves or worked with their staff on drawing the lines. They have always brought in experts. And in terms of a partisan slant, you never know how judges are going to act. And I think with the US Supreme Court, the decision today was a surprise. But let's get back to the Virginia Supreme Court. Just in recent cases, they ruled with Governor Northam, you know, on upholding his firearm ban around the Capitol. On the COVID-19 authority, Virginia Supreme Court ruled with the governor. So there have been several examples where this Virginia Supreme Court actually looked at the law and made a determination. So I don't think we can draw the conclusion that having the Virginia Supreme Court make a decision would necessarily be a partisan move. And finally, I will just say, you can't rule out the Virginia Supreme Court in any model here. If the General Assembly draws the lines, I can almost assure you that map will be, there'll be a lawsuit over that map, and that lawsuit will go to the Supreme Court. So just the way our checks and balances work, you can't carve out the Supreme Court from the checks and balances that, in fact, courts were intended to provide. So I hope this context is a good counterbalance to Delegate Levine's. I'm looking forward to questions. And I just want to say, Delegate Levine, when this constitutional amendment passes, I will be right with you on good enabling legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Favola. Next, we'll go over to Delegate Scott. Delegate Scott, you have 5 minutes to make opening remarks. It seems that Delegate Scott might have briefly stepped away, so we will continue. We will go forward to, oh, there he is. Delegate Scott, you have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, I don't know if I'm gonna need that much time, but thank you all for having me. This is a very interesting conversation. I noticed I made one mistake. I said every member of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus in the chat voted against this thing in the House of Delegates. There are 4 members in the Black Caucus in the Senate. They voted for it. And of the 18, 17 voted against it. Our Palestinian brother, Levasseur, was the only one that voted against it, voted with the amendment. As a freshman, I got the opportunity to delve into this issue. And as someone who has traditionally followed the whole argument around redistricting, and as I was running my district, I'm in House District 80 in Portsmouth, was affected by the redistricting. I think I got a little bit more Republican because of the lawsuit that was filed. And so I paid very close attention to the arguments being made during this time frame. And it kind of concerned me. The number one concern I always had was, and as an attorney, when I see things get put in the Constitution, they're supposed to be hard. Things that you put in should be very difficult to put in because they're usually very difficult to take out. And when I hear people saying, well, they voted for it last year, so they should vote for it again this year, and somehow we should discredit them if somebody voted for it the year before. What I would do, I would have more respect for someone who said, I voted for it last year, I looked at it, it doesn't work, I learned more, I got new information, I see the impact, And so I'm going to vote against this thing because I think it doesn't work the way I think we can do a better job. I would look at it more. That's why it's so hard to do it, because it has to vote. It has to pass the General Assembly twice, and then it has to be, given to the people, and it has to pass the people twice. So I think I would not discredit anyone who wised up and voted against the amendment. If you take a look at the way it's done, it really concerned me because we have a constitutional amendment right now that everybody thought was wise, especially those Republicans who now folks on this call have so much faith in. They voted for a constitutional amendment to ban what we call now gay marriage, same-sex marriage. And that constitutional amendment right now in the state of Virginia is still on the books. It's still on the books. And we're stuck with it. It has been introduced to overturn that amendment, to take it out. It hadn't passed because it was a majority of Republicans. Hopefully, in this next go around, we can get it out before they gerrymander it again and become in the majority again. As Delegate Levine said, the minority leader Todd Gilbert said himself that his most important tool and weapon to be able to gain the majority back in the House of Delegates was this redistricting amendment. I know that it is, I heard Mr. Vassar say that this was a bipartisan deal. And the first time it passed, it was mostly Republicans. And the last time it passed in the House of Delegates, it was mostly Republicans. Most Democrats voted against it. So what I'm trying to figure out is why are Democrats now defending something that the majority of the House of Delegates, the People's House in Virginia, the ones closest, the ones who are usually most relevant, every 2 years we have to run for a reason. It's every 2 years because we're supposed to have our fingers on the pulse of the people. And, some people are saying that, well, they just want to get reelected. They just want to guarantee their election. That's not true. Every member of the Black Caucus has been impacted by gerrymandering in this state. We have fought tooth and nail for everything that we've received, everything that we've got. We have to fight for it. And now to put this thing, and then I hear some naivety. Every day, everyone is waiting with bated breath, waiting to see what the United States Supreme Court will do. And we're like, wow, we can't believe they actually affirmed that gay people can be discriminated against. And we were like, oh my God, we're shocked that they did the right thing. That is what we're asking right now. We're hoping and praying that these people will do the right thing. The Virginia Supreme Court, on the record, they are the most partisan of any Supreme Court in this area. The Court of Appeals in the state of Virginia, and I practice here, and a lot of people do, they rarely, if ever, overturn a criminal case. Ever. Okay? They are very difficult. So we already know once we appeal something to them, we got to go to the Virginia Supreme Court. The criminal case law in the state of Virginia is archaic. And so now we're asking the same people who created a system where 55% of the people incarcerated in Virginia DOC are Black people. We're only 19% Black. So we say, no, these are the fair-minded people who are going to fix everything for us because these things are unrelated. The racial gerrymandering and the prison population and the criminal justice system and what the police are doing to African America, all of this stuff to me is all gobbled up together. And now we're saying that our backstop, God forbid, our backstop is the Virginia Supreme Court. How naive can you be? This is ridiculous. Now, if we had seen,
Scott, we're unfortunately coming up on time.
Okay, cool. Because I just want to say this bill is not a fair redistricting amendment. This is a hyper-partisan redistricting amendment. It gives all the politicians all the power. And at the end of the day, we're going to be dependent. This is not the California deal that they have. This is not California. This is the opposite of California. And I'm done.
Thank you, Delegate. We will certainly come back and revisit some of those comments. Our next panelist is Ms. Feng.
Hi, everybody. First, I want to just thank the Virginia Arlington Democrats for inviting us to this important forum and for having a very vigorous debate. And as somebody from California, I'm just going to say, watching this process happen in Virginia, watching the Virginia legislature pass this amendment 2 times, once through the Republican-controlled legislature and once through the Democratic-controlled legislature, and now push this constitutional amendment to the people to vote on it, is really something that we have a lot to be impressed with. In California, when we want an initiative, when we want to pass a law, when the legislature isn't doing the right thing, We have the ability to gather signatures and place it on the ballot. In Virginia, you don't have that path. You have to go through the legislature. And so what's been impressive to me is the ability to create a constitutional amendment that creates as many safeguards as possible with citizen involvement, active involvement in the redistricting process, while still leaving some role for the legislature to be involved. I think that in a lot of ways, Delegate Levine, you gave us two sayings. Let me share one that I think is important. A bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. If you don't support this amendment, let us be very clear. What you're going to get is partisan gerrymandering or racial gerrymandering by the legislature in 2021. It's going to be redistricting that is carried out by the legislature and not by some imaginary perfect redistricting commission, because there isn't time to do that between now and 2021. The possibility of two birds in the bush isn't the same as getting something, a fair change in time for the 2021 redistricting process. I think it's important to think about how Virginia's proposed constitutional amendment compares to some of the other amendments that are out there that have changed in the 2018 elections. There were 5 states that adopted some kind of redistricting reform: Michigan, Colorado, Ohio, Missouri, Utah. At the one end, you've got Michigan that created a true citizens commission like California. They've got an initiative, so they've got that ability. On the other end, you've got states like Utah that created a set of rules. In some ways, it's sort of like what Florida did. Set of rules that you have to follow, but it's still the legislature drawing the lines. And in between, you've got states like Colorado and Ohio. They create something of a hybrid commission. They create some rules. They make sure that no vote can happen with just a one-party, straight down the line vote. There's got to be some compromise involved. And in the end, they build in a lot of protections for transparency and public involvement. And that, I think, is really at the heart of the redistricting reform effort. And it's why we are so strongly in support of the Virginia constitutional amendment, because what it does is it puts people in the driver's seat again, because what you really want to make sure of is that the lines that are drawn respect communities and respect the Voting Rights Act, and in particular, look at where populations are growing, reflect those demographic changes like Northern Virginia gaining so much population, and not always at what populations or what constituencies voted to get an incumbent in place last election, right? When the legislature draws the lines, they always tend to be backwards looking. And so you cement certain constituencies as the base, and you forget that there's populations that are growing. The constitutional amendment is exciting to me because it actually ends 4 types of gerrymandering, or it makes it possible to end those. 1, it ends partisan gerrymandering. It ends mid-decade gerrymandering. It creates a road for take care of prison-based gerrymandering. And most importantly, it ends racial gerrymandering. Now, there are a lot of folks who will say, yes, the Voting Rights Act, at the federal level, we have those protections. I want to focus a little bit on what happened in California and why we passed our redistricting commission. In 2008, we saw firsthand how incumbents in California, by the way, these are democratically controlled legislature and our Democratic governor, carved up Latino districts, Latino communities, and Asian American communities all across the state. We organized those communities to participate in the redistricting process, and we presented maps. We poured our heart and soul out to talk about why our communities should not be cut up into pieces. And in the end, the legislature went behind closed doors and drew the lines to protect every single incumbent. And if that meant cutting up a community that might have been rising because they were afraid that they weren't going to vote for them, then that's what they did. Now, MALDEF brought a lawsuit to try to challenge those lines because there were 170,000 Latinos that were cut out of a white incumbent legislator's district. He didn't want to face a Latino challenger. The courts decided to put incumbent protection ahead of Voting Rights Act protections. And that was in 2011. The reality is that the Supreme Court and our courts have only eviscerated the Voting Rights Act protections even more than that. We've seen Shelby County take away Section 5 protections. We've seen case after case. So unfortunately, when it comes to the Voting Rights Act, we don't know how much is going to be left by the time Virginia tries to seek some protections under court law. What we
Ms.
do,
Feng,
what we
I'm
do-
sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but we do want to be respectful of the 5-minute time limit of the other
Okay.
panelists. I hope you hold those thoughts for later on.
Let me
during our
just
question
finish
and
one
answer period.
sentence. What we do
Sure.
know is that the Constitution has put in language that specifically protects voting rights at the state level into the state constitution. And that's a new protection that is raced forward that Virginia never had. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Mr. Levasseur. Mr. Levasseur, you have 5 minutes as well.
Thank you very much, Praveen, and thank you to the Arlington Democrats. I don't bring the rhetorical firepower of Mark Levine or the eloquence of Scott to our side of the argument, but I do bring the work of a grassroots activist and for a time a person in one of the Democratic committees in Fairfax County. I was one of the co-authors of the resolutions that passed in the FCDC opposing the amendment, and so what I wanted to focus on in my few minutes here is one of the major problems with the amendment that I think has been brushed over a bit during some of the earlier comments. This notion that the structure of the commission that's created by the amendment is going to get rid of partisan gerrymandering. It is, Mr. Vassar said it, it's up on the One Virginia 2021 website, this notion that it's going to end partisan gerrymandering. It's just not true. That's not what the commission is. It's not what the commission is going to do. The commission, as the slides demonstrated, consists of 8 partisan politicians and 8 citizens. Now you think 8 citizens are going to balance the partisan politicians out until you look at how are the citizens chosen. They're chosen by the politicians, and let's just be straightforward, they're going to be beholden to the people who selected them. They're not neutrals. They are people who are selected by the politicians, and you're going to have, so basically we're transferring the constitutional function of redrawing lines. And let's be clear, everybody on this panel, I'm sure, wants to get rid of gerrymandering, and we want to do it properly, but we don't want to transfer the function from the legislature to a partisan commission. And that's what it is. You have 8 politicians and 8 citizens chosen by politicians. Now, that is, when I was initially learned about the work of One Virginia 2021 and the whole process of anti-gerrymandering that was going on in the Commonwealth, I was told, as I've heard over and over again, we want to get politicians out of the process. This doesn't do it. The amendment that is going to be voted on in November doesn't get politicians out of the process. They are going to be in control of the process, and that is just it's a bit deceptive to a lot of the voters. Now, admittedly, the language on the ballot says 8 politicians and 8 citizens, but the way that this is being sold, and the way that when you talk to voters in the grassroots and in the Democratic committees, what you hear is, I want the amendment to pass because I want politicians out of the process. And the horror that you see on their faces when you explain to them, this doesn't get the politicians out of the process. They're still in the process. They're still driving the commission. We want a nonpartisan commission. That's what we should have in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'll leave it to Mark, Delegate Levine, to sort out exactly, to make all the arguments about how it can actually happen. But I just disagree with something I saw in the chat from Julia Tanner. This is not a circumstance of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're talking about something bad. We're talking about transferring the power to a partisan commission, and then having that partisan commission, as Delegate Scott said, once it's there, it's going to be ridiculously difficult to fix. I've heard people from One Virginia 2021 say, as soon as we get the amendment, we are all going to start working on improving the amendment. Well, why would we? I mean, it is really difficult to take things out of the Constitution. The example of the anti-LGBT amendment is a very good one from Delegate Scott. You don't put something that's flawed into a constitution, particularly one like the one we have here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that's extraordinarily difficult to amend. It just is a flawed proposal. And the other thing I wanted to comment on was this notion that we would trust Republicans. There's no dispute that in order for this thing to, if this amendment passes, we are going to have to trust the Republicans on the commission to not exercise the two-commissioner veto that, that Delegate Levine explained. And we're going to have to trust the very conservatives. I know they're not technically Republicans on the Supreme Court, but we're not going to have to trust the Republican-appointed members of the very conservative Supreme Court to not gerrymander us in the courts. And Senator Favola makes the argument, I've heard this as well, that courts have never actually engaged in gerrymandering, but we're just going to have to trust them. That's what we're going to have to do. And I'm sorry, I'm a grassroots activist who's been alive for the last 30 years, and I don't find myself generally trusting Republicans when it comes to matters of policy.
Mr. Levasseur, we are approaching on your time. Do you have one last, do you want to complete your sentence?
Nah, I pretty much did. That's good. I'm very concerned with the idea that we're going to just throw this into the laps of the Republicans and trust them.
Great, no problem. We're going to have plenty more in the program where everyone hopefully can get a chance to address their points. That portion concludes the opening statement portion of the roundtable. I see that the chat is very lively and some of the panelists are engaging in the chat themselves, and we certainly encourage that. If you have questions for the panelists, they can get to it when they can. But we're going to go ahead with the question and answer portion of the program. And the way this works is each of our panelists will have 2 minutes to ask the question, and then 60 seconds will be provided to the opposing side to offer a brief counterpoint. So each of the questions will be asked to 3 individuals who share similar viewpoints, and in between we'll have 1 minute in case the other side wants to make a rebuttal to one of the points that was being made. If that seems a little confusing, hopefully past after the first round, we're in full stride and it all makes sense. So the first question is for the proponents of the amendment. Each panelist on the proponent side will receive the same question. So the question is, how can we prevent the Redistricting Commission members who are members of the General Assembly and also citizen members nominated by politically biased interests for undermining redistricting reform? I'll read that one more time. How can we prevent the Redistricting Commission members who are members of the General Assembly and also citizen members nominated by politically biased interests from underwhelming redistricting reform? Mr. Vassar, we'll have you go first.
Praveen, may I go first? Because I have to
Yeah, I
leave.
defer to Senator Favola.
Senator Favola, you were next, so we'll just swap you and Mr. Vassar.
Just swap me. I'm going to have to leave, and I will allow Bobby Vassar to take my 2-minute closing time allotment. Let me respond to that question. I mean, the biggest protection we have is really the transparency provision in the amendment. And that sunshine does a lot to ensure that behavior meets the standards that are expected of it. And let me make a couple of points. Yes, there are 8 lawmakers. That is true, 4 from each body, House and Senate, and then evenly divided. But the other 8 citizens are appointed by retired circuit court judges. So they don't have a vested interest in who sits on the commission. So I think that needs to be clear. The politicians are only appointing 8 members. The citizens will be appointed by retired circuit court judges, which I think allows some distance in my view. And then I do want to note just a fact that I think is important. Everybody seems to be concerned about the Virginia Supreme Court, and Luke is, you know, a great lawyer and doesn't want to trust anything he can't see, touch, feel, and maybe influence. But there was a case in the Bethune Hill, the redistricting case, which was ruled on in 2019. And the fact of the matter is Democrats picked up seats, you know, in part, not totally, but in part, as a result of the redraw of those districts. So those districts are redrawn in a way that more closely honored the one man, one vote, which was what the premise of that lawsuit was. And the Supreme Court actually they had experts draw it, but districts were drawn in a way where the Democrats ended up taking the majority in 2019. So that's my thought for the moment. I'm going to have to leave, but we have two great panelists on the pro amendment side, and I thank Mike Heminger and the Arlington Democrats for pulling together a really great panel. And I again apologize for having to leave, but thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, Senator Favola.
Thank you.
We appreciate having you here.
I appreciate it.
So now the opposing viewpoint gets 1 minute. Mr. Scott mentioned that he has something. Mr. Scott, would you like to offer opposing viewpoint? You have 1 minute to counter.
First of all, thank you. I got 1 minute. You got me on the clock. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm not trying to impugn our system. This system is the system that we have, and I work in it every day. I just don't have the blind faith and trust that Senator Favola has in Circuit Court judges. I know no one more politically in my life. No one more political in this whole community where I live than judges. They pay attention to everything political. So to say that judges have no vested interest in stuff is a little bit unrealistic and maybe a lot naive, because Virginia appoints judges through the legislature. So you have a beholden interest to make sure that you please the people that are responsible for reappointing you. I also heard people say, well, y'all voted for some of these Supreme Court judges, because people have to understand when we vote on these people, sometimes there's a culture in the House of Delegates and the General Assembly that you mind your business. If somebody comes in and you have some questions about them, what you might do is you might pull their name out of consideration, how judges are selected, and you may not vote on them, but it still may be an overwhelming vote to some folks that appear to it. So my issue is not about judges. I mean, I just don't have the same faith in relying on judges for the end game, because I really believe in the political process. And I think that we should make sure that we put a situation in place similar to what Ms. Feng has done in California. I like that. I don't think we finish with we say this is a good enough deal. I know I got a few seconds, but what we're saying is we're going to take good enough, enshrine it in our Constitution, and hope like hell it doesn't screw up. And I see too many ways to kill any kind of so-called bipartisan kumbaya in this thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. We actually swapped Ms. Vassar and Mr. Vassar and Senator Favola. So Mr. Vassar, did you want to answer?
Yeah, I think the question of how can we trust anybody to perform public trust responsibilities is always going to be there. Of course, you have to have a system that trusts people, no matter what system you have. You're not operating in a vacuum. You're talking about lesser of evils, if that's the way you want to look at it. And we've trusted the legislature to perform the function for decades, and we see the problems that develop. And there are those who think that, yeah, well, you can, rearrange the deck chairs and fix this or that, and legislators will come out doing the right thing in the end. Yeah, I think that could be an approach, but I think what we've seen is that the temptation to do self-dealing, incumbent protection, the kinds of things that are human and that come to fore are going to occur there, and to an extent that it's proven to not be the kind of system that we believe is the one to continue with. We've seen other jurisdictions where states where other approaches have worked better, and I think it's time that we remove a problem that we know exists and we try a different approach. That's what this calls for, a different approach, trusting other institutions with guidelines and structures, and the legislature is there to say, hey, this doesn't work the way we intended. Let's pass a law that improves this. And that's always the case, whatever system we have. So I just don't buy the notion that you can't trust people to do the jobs that they're given. I think that's the only way a public system will ever work.
All right, thank you, Mr. Vassar. Does anyone have any comments back to Mr. Vassar from the opposing viewpoint?
I do.
Yeah, please proceed, Delegate. You have 1 minute.
Thank you, Praveen. So Bobby Vassar makes a good point, which is that people are going to act in their self-interest. Well, in California, the judges aren't chosen by the legislature. There's actually only 2 legislators in the entire country where the legislature chooses the judges. It's Virginia and South Carolina. The governor has no say. The voters have no say. So if a judge wants to protect their interests, the best way to do that is to make sure that you design a legislature, and we're giving full power to the Virginia Supreme Court without any standards. Remember, if they had standards, we might constrain them, but the amendment has no standards. It puts in the Constitution, draw, gerrymander however you like. So ask the sister of a sitting Republican senator, will she help her brother? Ask Ken Cuccinelli's right-hand man, will he help Republicans? Ask a former Republican delegate and a former Republican senator, do you think they'll help the Republican Party? I don't believe that political animals, men and women, suddenly they put on a robe and they forget their politics. I think we've seen it too often. The clear example is the Bethune Hill case, which Barbara Favola mentioned. That was not the Virginia Supreme Court at all. It was a federal court. And what happened when 2 Republican judges and 1 Democratic judge considered the case? We lost. Then it came back on remand, and there were 2 Democratic judges and 1 Republican judge, and we won. Now, maybe that was only a coincidence, but I think it's a very interesting coincidence that the political parties of the judges determined the case. And yeah, at least Bethune Hill was according to law, but this amendment gives no standard to the Virginia Supreme Court. They have no law to go by. I think they will go by their politics. Lastly, very quickly, the citizens that are appointed, that are chosen by judges, it's from a list entirely chosen by politicians. So I get to pick my 6 friends if I'm on the committee, and I trust my 6 friends who are ordinary citizens to do what I want. So none of the citizens come from a general pool. They all are chosen by the politicians. It's a problem.
Thank you, Delegate. Ms. Feng?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the bird in the hand analogy, because I will say that in California, one of the hardest decisions that we had to make in 2008 was that when we ran the initiative the first time, we had created a commission, but it only drew state legislative lines. And in our coalition, the thing that people kept saying was, you only get 1 shot at this. You know, why are you not going to tackle Congress? Why aren't you going to define communities of interest? Why aren't you going to do 10 more things? And what we said was, look, we know what the opposition is. We know how hard it is. And if we can get a bird in the hand, it's better than 2 in the bush. We ended up passing that initiative, and then we came back 2 years later. And by this point, the citizens of California, instead of passing it closely, they had seen the possibilities of what it means when you put some citizens in charge, when you open up the process, when you make it more transparent, when you give people a way to tell their story about their communities and actually be heard. And as a result, the second time around, we came back in 2010 and we passed an initiative that added congressional redistricting, that added definitions for communities of interest, that added a lot of important things that strengthened our first initiative. That was just 2 years later, but it passed by over 66%. I bring this up because I know that a lot of people say, why should we adopt something that isn't perfect right now? And the reality is, in 2021, you all will have to redistrict. And so if you don't have something in place, the process is basically back to the legislature for a full legislative gerrymandering. There are no holds barred. And frankly, whatever legislators are promising you, we know legislatures ultimately fall back on incumbent protection and looking at the constituencies that brought them there. They're never looking forward, they're always looking back. If you pass the constitutional amendment, even if it's not perfect, you will put some checks and balances into the place, and for the first time, you will have embedded in the state constitution language that protects the minority voting rights of minorities in the state constitution. So even if the Supreme Court continues to do its erosion of the Voting Rights Act, you will be able to sue in state court, just like we did in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and successfully use state constitution to protect Minority Voting Rights Act. What's important about that is in state after state, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, these are not courts that are known to be Democratic controlled or necessarily friendly to the voting rights of minorities. But they have, in case after case, upheld state constitutional protections when voters say that that's what they want in redistricting. And we've seen partisan gerrymanders get struck, and we've seen racial gerrymanders get struck by courts where it's embedded in the state constitution. That's the important piece of it, right? We're saying that these are what the rules are. And I think that that's really worth remembering. We don't have those protections right now. If you pass the Constitution, you will have those protections. And on top of that, after that, if there are improvements that need to be made, you've got a democratically controlled legislature that promises that they want something better, hold their feet to the fire and say, yeah, let's do it then. Let's make that even better. But it's not going to happen by 2021. So you got to create a better process for now. And then if you want the California model for 2030, great, let's do that. But that can't pass now. So we've got what we've got.
Thank you, Ms. Feng. Does the pro side have any counterpoints to Ms. Feng's points?
Well,
You have 1
this
minute.
I mean, obviously, we don't. This is not California, where the amendment, once it's in the Constitution, it can't be changed easily. Ms. Feng just described a series of changes that were possible. Obviously, legislation theoretically could be, but we're talking about putting a commission structure in the Constitution, and that is extremely difficult to change. It's not something that can easily be adjusted. And with respect to Mr. Vassar's comments, obviously, we're not people who don't trust institutions. We're trying to make the government work better for everybody. The problem that we have is creating a partisan commission to do this work. That is not what the idea was, and that's not the way that it's being sold frequently to people. We're talking about people who believe, a lot of people in Virginia, I think, believe that we're taking the work, we're taking the redistricting out of the hands of the politicians, and we're putting it into a group of independent hands, and that's not what's happening. But with this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Levasseur. We'll go on to our second question now, and this question will be for the panelists in opposition to the amendment. We'll follow the same format. We'll have 2 minutes for each of the panelists and then 1 minute from the opposing viewpoint to answer any points made. So the question is, in addition to the constitutional amendment during the 2020 session, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 717, which establishes standards and criteria for the apportionment process. There has been disagreement on which law would prevail, Senate Bill 717 or the Constitution. Which law prevails, and please explain why. Delegate Levine?
Sure, it's very simple, and this is something that even proponents of the amendment have made clear. The Constitution always trumps a law. You've heard all the time that this law was declared unconstitutional. That means the law dies because it disagrees with the Constitution. You've never heard someone say the Constitution was found illegal, that we're going to ignore the Constitution and follow the law. It's never happened in America. Every lawyer, frankly, every school child knows the reason we have a Constitution is the Constitution prevails over an ordinary law. So when the Constitution says if Todd Gilbert wills it, the Supreme Court can establish districts without any criteria, then the Supreme Court can establish districts without any criteria. Well, what about ethics laws? It doesn't matter. Constitution trumps the law. What about Senate Bill 717? Great bill. It would actually constrain us if we were to draw the districts. It would constrain the independent commission, which is what I want to see passed in 2021. And by the way, I think would be really likely to pass. Talking about a bird in the hand, if the Republicans don't get this constitutional amendment that they want so badly, they'll have to join the 90% of Democrats that are in favor of an independent commission. And by the way, we can't police the Virginia Supreme Court. We have no power over them, but you can police us. You can police me. I run in Arlington. I've got a primary challenger. If I don't support an independent commission, someone should primary me. And mark my words, you should. I do. I introduced an independent commission. So the question comes down to who do you trust? Since the Constitution trumps any ordinary law, don't put in the Constitution something that even proponents of the constitutional amendment agree is flawed. We can do this, and we can do it in time. We can do it in 2021. virtually every Democrat is on record in supporting it. And Republicans, as much as they want full power to them through the Supreme Court, if they don't get full power to them, they'll have to acquiesce to agree in joint power. We can get this independent commission. We can get it in 2021. We can only get it if folks vote no on the constitutional amendment.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Levine.
That's rare.
No, thank you for that. But does the opposing viewpoint have a minute to counter any of Delegate Levine's points?
Yeah, this is Bobby Vassar. I'm not sure I understand what the conflict is here. You know, it sounds like there's a notion that the Supreme Court won't follow state law. I'm not getting what the point being made here is, that the Supreme Court is going to look at, oh, the Constitution says we don't have to follow state law. I don't get that. I think if there's a law that's passed by the legislature that impacts a process that the court is involved in, that law is going to impact the Supreme Court. I don't know what the precedent is that someone can point to where the court has said, oh yeah, we have this law over here, the legislature says what it intends to be done with this process, but we've got the Constitution, so we don't need to listen to some law that the legislature thinks is going to impact us. We can just tell the legislature, forget about you. And when our time comes up to be reappointed by the legislature, you know, or the process that the courts are developed through, we can just say, well, you know, we have the power, so we don't have to listen to you. That's not realistic. These officials operate through ethics and through laws, and they look to guidance. And the processes and any experience we've seen suggests that the courts will look for criteria, will look for what the legislature is intended a process to be like. So I'm not sure I understand why there's a conflict in the Constitution and a law that's not designed to be in conflict with the Constitution, but to further and to implement the provision of the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Vassar. Delegate Scott.
Yeah, you know, when I hear all of the arguments, it comes back to the simple premise. I've met a lot of the advocates for this. I got a lot of respect for what they do. I've listened to Ms. Feng from California. I've looked at her stuff. I've looked online to try to see what the best formula was. I just think that what's wrong with doing it right? I mean, I have a problem with saying, look, take the bird in the hand that is flawed, the dead bird that may kill us all. Take that bird, as opposed to putting an amendment on the line that actually gets us to a non-political, non-politicians involved. California, it's unique. They select Democrats and Republicans who are registered. They have to apply, and they select independents, and then that citizen community comes together, people of goodwill, and they go through the process of drawing the line. What we've done here is said, you know what, we can't do that. That's too much like right. Let's take the worst of the worst. Let's take this and let's put something together that's much less than even anything good. And let's let the legislators, 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate, the minority leader in the House and the speaker, they pick 2-2, and the Senate President Pro Tem picks 2, and the minority leader in the Senate pick 2. So now we have 8 politicians who are very good at politics. Y'all hear how good Levine is. He'll talk you into buying some water. He'll talk a well into buying water. So now you got these politicians mixed in with the civilians that are influencing. Who you think gonna win that battle? You got 8 and 8 in the room, and then at the end of the day, the thing gets all squelched up. Any 2 members on either side, House or Republicans or Democrats. I'm not ascribing Republicans to be the only ones that kill it. It may be 2 Dems that want to kill it. Now we go to the Supreme Court. That's where I get very concerned. I keep seeing people saying, oh, the Supreme Court, they'll always do the right thing. Not true. Even in Bethune-Cookman, Bethune-Hill went to the Supreme Court of the feds, didn't go through the state. And so now we're in a position now where we're depending on these non-elected people. I much prefer to put my trust in the people, a true citizen-based redistricting committee or commission. as opposed to some political hybrid thingy that we have now that is enshrined in our Constitution. That is the most important thing. I am very afraid to vote on this thing in November. And I got a funny feeling it's going to win because there are people who are framing this as a nonpartisan. Every time they say it, they say it's nonpartisan. And they're basically lying to people. It's hyper partisan. If you sell it as it is. If you really believe in it, sell it as it is. It's a hyper partisan mixed with some citizens, and it can be vetoed and killed by two politicians. And then at the end of the day, we'll end up with the Supreme Court drawing. Just tell the truth. If you believe in it that much, tell the truth about this thing. This pig with the nice makeup on. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Scott. Does anyone have any points to make in rebuttal to Mr. Scott?
Well, hi, this is Kathay.
A quick minute.
I will welcome collaboration after this amendment passes to work with Delegate Scott and Delegate Levine any day to try to pass 2 times out of the legislature something that is as good as California's amendment or Michigan's law. I really think that if this thing is as bad as you all say, it will motivate the legislature and the people to want to pass something that's even better. And if it's not as bad as you say, it'll give people a taste of what true democracy tastes like, and they're going to want more anyways. Either way, I don't see this as an impediment to improvement. Sometimes change is hard, and particularly the way that Virginia has to adopt constitutional amendments 2 times through the legislature and 1 time, 1 vote of the people. It's going to be a hard road one way or the other. So dangling the idea of a California-style constitutional change is amazing, and I really want to stand with you on that. But you haven't even gotten 1 vote out of the legislature for a California-style commission. So that hope for 2021 isn't there. Now, you're going to have to draw lines with something or another. And what you're really saying is trust the legislature for this first time, and then maybe we'll pass something better for the future, right? And so that's what the Arlington Democrats have to decide on. Is that what they're okay with?
Thank you, Ms. Feng. And I want to thank the panelists all for staying approximately within their time limit, which is very much appreciated considering our time frame. So we have 2 final questions, 1 for each side. Since we started with the proponents in the last round, we'll start with the other viewpoint of the amendment this round. The format will remain the same. So the question is, claims have been made that if this amendment does not pass in the upcoming election, there will not be another real opportunity to redraw maps in Virginia until the next census. Is there accuracy in this statement? And is there another way that maps could be redrawn? Delegate Levine, we'll have you go first.
Thank you, Praveen. That is not true. We can pass and should pass and will have to pass in 2021 if the amendment fails. We will have to pass something else. Now, virtually every Democrat in the General Assembly is on record as supporting nonpartisan independent commission. It's certainly a majority of us. And here's the thing, the Republicans who are now all supporting this amendment, if the amendment fails, they'll have nowhere to go but to join us in supporting a true independent commission, whether California style or One Virginia 2021's original commission, which I put forward. And I think Republicans would have to support. They think they can get something better. They think they can get a pure Republican gerrymander. So they're not with us. But I'm on record, a lot of folks are on record, and it does come down to who you trust. Do you trust a Supreme Court appointed by Republicans, including Ken Cuccinelli's right-hand man, sister of sitting Republican, a former Republican delegate senator, a 5-2, basically conservative court, maybe 6-1, or do you trust your own legislators, the people you in Arlington elect, people like me, people like Patrick Holt, Marcus Simon, Alfonso Lopez, all of whom voted against this, because you can actually take action if we do the wrong thing. You can primary us if we do the wrong thing, and we're on record as supporting an independent commission. So you can hold us to account. The problem with Kathay Feng's idea that we should pass this, and if it doesn't work, try something else, it's too late. Once we pass this, and once we get a sharp Republican gerrymander, which everyone agrees that can be done under this amendment, then in 2021, you have Republican majority. Well, the Republican majority is not going to take away from their power. No, they'll reappoint Supreme Court justices who will choose the legislature, who will choose the justices, and the people will never get a chance to get involved. So this is a one-way ratchet. We can never, ever, ever come back if you pass the amendment. If you go against the amendment, then you can have the power to help us design the correct system. And I actually do have a constitutional amendment in that would take place, yes, in 2022, a year too late, but that does all the things we're talking about: nonpartisan redistricting, independent commission. Mine actually has a mathematical model to ensure fairness that a professor on this call helped me design. We can do better, but if we go the wrong way, we can never reclaim Virginia.
Okay. Does anyone have any rebuttals to
Yeah, this
Delegate Levine?
Bobby Vassar.
Mr. Vassar.
I'd like to remind Delegate Levine and Delegate Scott that we have a nonpartisan Supreme Court. And somehow or another, they seem to, I mean, I'm not aware that Supreme Court members present themselves as Democrats or Republicans. They present themselves as applicants for, or people being considered for appointment to the court, not on the basis of their politics. And so somehow or another, these nonpartisan citizens that they're talking about are going to appear out of thin air. Nobody's going to have to appoint them. No politician is going to touch them. They're just going to show up and be nonpartisan, and that's going to solve everything, just like, you know, the Supreme Court being nonpartisan solves everything when they say it doesn't. So anyway you go, somebody is going to have to be involved in the process, and I'll bet you there are going to be some politicians who are going to make some of these decisions. But beyond that, we're always operating in a context of limited choices. Somebody's got to do it. And so of the institutions, of the opportunities that you have, what seems to be best? What are other states doing that suggests is the best practice? And having the Supreme Court as the fail-safe fall to is viewed as the gold standard, as opposed to having the legislature do it, which is what you're trying to get away from. And so their notion that if you let the legislature continue to have control, and that's what I'm talking about, even no matter what you do, if you have control of it, you don't have to, you can change it. And the minute something doesn't go the way you like, if you have control, it's going to be changed. And we're talking about not partisan commission, we're talking about a bipartisan commission that's equally balanced. And I trust Louise Lucas to make reasonable decisions. I trust the Speaker of the House to make reasonable decisions. I don't see how we get away from that. So this notion that we've got structures that are influenced improperly by a political party or another, I don't know how you get away from.
Thank you, Mr. Vassar. Actually, you mentioned Delegate Scott, and Delegate Scott is actually next to answer the question. Delegate Scott, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Oh.
I think it's really simple. I mean, we fought like heck to get this thing out. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, let's just be honest. I see some comments and things, but unfortunately, there was a lot of pressure on people to do what we did last session in 2019. When I say we, I mean them, because I was not there at the time. And when I got there and saw where we were with this redistricting, and I can tell you, I voted against the redistricting amendment the first time because I'm not comfortable with, before I was in, when I say we voted against it, I mean voted against it here in my local polling station. I was not a member of the House of Delegates, but as soon as I got there, I immediately started advocating that this thing was bad for the Black community. If you look at what we're talking about right now, we're talking about, you know, Black Lives Matter and all this stuff. I mean, listen to Black people. And now I get on this call and they say, nope, don't listen to Black people, because every member, save one in the House of Delegates, voted against this thing. Now in the Senate, different power dynamic, different ball game. 4 members of the Senate are Black, and in the House of Delegates, it's 19 of us. I said 18, it's 19 of us, but 18, all except Sam Rasool, voted against it and spoke passionately against it, because we understand what this thing can do. it will enshrine something that we cannot change. It's very simple. We could place criteria. We can pick the type of, we can draw the maps right now without an amendment that Ms. Feng would have drawn in California. We can put criteria in place to pick a non-legislator citizen panel. No one has ever said we don't want, we know that everybody who votes for a politician. We want some Democrats, we want some Republicans, and we want some independent citizens. See that in all caps, C-I-T-I-Z-E-N-S. Political citizens that may be partisan, that may be independent, and they come together and they redraw the maps with the help maybe of a special master and some advisors. Not politicians engaged in the process. Once you do that and then the politicians have the power to veto, you have created a flawed system, and that is what this is. And now we're dependent on the Virginia Supreme Court, one of the most conservative courts in the country, to change it. If you don't believe me, just look at the data. The data says that the Virginia Supreme Court, by outcomes, are one of the most conservative Supreme Courts in the country. Look at our numbers. And you'd want Black people to trust that? We're 19% of the population, and we're 55% of those incarcerated. Either you believe that Black folks are either predisposed to crime, or you believe that the white superiority theory that we predisposed to crime, or you believe that this system is racially discriminatory in everything about it. And now you're telling Black people and telling us to trust these same people to take care of our voting rights. I don't believe it.
Thank you, Delegate Scott. I'm actually being told that an Arlington Democrat activist, Chris Del Rosa, is joining us on the pro side for Senator Favola. Chris, do you have a rebuttal to that point that Delegate Scott just made?
Well, I wanted to. Hi. Yes, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a political appointee or a politician. I'm not an elected official. I'm not a paid consultant or lobbyist. I am just someone who has been working on this issue for a few years. So I am in favor of the constitutional amendment, although it is not perfect. It has a lot of pluses to it. For the first time ever, we will have citizens on the commission, equal in number. A citizen will lead the commission. For the first time, we will have transparency. I think that is so critical. Doesn't matter who's drawing the maps. If we can't see what they're doing or hear what they're saying, we are left in the dark. So this is a way, again, for citizens and anyone who's interested to keep an eye on what's going on. That will be in the constitutional amendment. We also have wording in there that will protect the rights of minority voters, including the Black community. Again, that will be permanent in the Constitution. I think that's important. You could write another constitutional amendment later, but the soonest you can have, say, an all-citizen commission would be in 2022, 2023. We cannot wait that long. We need to do this now, and certainly the legislature will be motivated to pass enabling legislation to put guardrails around SCOVA. They had such a bill written that passed both houses, but because of minor language difficulties, it went to a conference committee, which did not report out. So the bill died. But we have things like requiring that Supreme Court justices, for example, recuse themselves if they are related in any way to a sitting member of the General Assembly, or I believe lobbyists or congressmen, past or present. So you could write additional language into bills to make sure that things are done. That bill also was directing the Supreme Court of Virginia to appoint 2 special masters to draw the maps, which they undoubtedly would do anyway. But if we put it in a bill and it becomes law, then that will be how it's done.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Levasseur, did you want to answer the question?
Sure. Well, I'll just respond to Mr. Rosa's points and address the question a little bit as well. But, you know, obviously, we don't dispute there are citizens involved in the commission as it's currently drawn. The problem is, as Delegate Scott pointed out, half of the members are politicians. And I just cannot accept the notion that 8 sitting politicians are going to be sitting in a room with 8 citizens who, it's true, they didn't pick directly, but they provide the pool from which judges have to pick. So they are essentially chosen citizens. And the notion that those citizens are going to you know, have some equal say. And I mean, they have the same number of votes, but that's not the same thing. And so the citizens that's not a full and fair protection. And we want an independent commission. That's what we should have. And I disagree with Ms. Feng. I just can't accept the notion that you put something that you recognize is flawed and that has these problems that everybody in this debate sees and recognizes, and everybody you talk to recognizes it's flawed. You just don't put something like that in a constitution. It's difficult to extract. And just to be clear, if this amendment doesn't pass, we won't have a commission in 2021. Nobody disputes that. But we can have we won't have an amendment, a constitutional commission, but we can have a commission by statute. It can be a fully independent commission, as Delegate Levine has proposed, and as other Delegate Price proposed, I believe. And we can have that by statute. It's not perfect. It's not the best thing in the world to have it by statute, but we will have protections in 2021, and we can have a better constitutional amendment for 2031. That's what we should do. We should vote no on the current amendment, and we should work for a statutory fix in 2021 and a constitutional fix in 2031.
Thank you, Mr. Levasseur. Ms. Feng, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah. First of all, I never said that this constitutional amendment is flawed. Everything can be improved. Our Constitution is a living document, and we should always be striving to make it better. That said, what I said was, you got to look at what you got and what you don't get. If you pass this constitutional amendment, you'll get 8 citizens and 8 politicians, with citizens leading a conversation that's open and public. If you don't pass it, you get 100% politicians in a room with no citizens at the table passing the redistricting maps. So, to Mr. Levasseur's, concern that the 8 citizens will be bamboozled by the 8 politicians, at least they're sitting at the table. I mean, what we got right now, if we don't pass that constitutional amendment, is they won't have a seat at the table, okay? Second of all, this concern that somehow the Supreme Court is going to run willy-nilly and that there are no guardrails and that it's very confusing. Because on the one hand, you're saying that, there's no guardrails and the Constitution trumps, right? But then you can pass a statute. The Constitution, if it was amended by this amendment, would create standards, but it doesn't speak to, and it leaves open a number of things. That's why the legislature can still fill in the blanks with enabling legislation. And so the court would have to follow both. It would follow the constitutional standards where the Constitution has spoken, and where it's silent, it would look to statute for that interpretation. Again, that's simple law. Everybody knows that. Third thing is that the reality is right now in 2021, there is something on the ballot. Democrats have controlled the legislature only for one session, but all of the things that we've been talking about, a citizens commission that could do the legislative process instead of the legislature, or the first step to creating a citizens commission that goes into the Constitution, where is that? Has it passed? Why hasn't that passed? If that's not an alternative that's live and here right now, then the only thing that we're really talking about is the constitutional amendment to create a hybrid commission versus partisan political gerrymandering. That's the choice.
Thank you, Ms. Feng. Now we're moving on to our final question of the evening before we move to closing statements. So thanks everyone for still being with us. Certainly getting a lot of viewpoints and learning a lot. So the final question, in the 2020 session of the General Assembly, Delegate Marcia Price proposed House Bill 1256, which proposes reform by legislation and not amendment, and also includes mandated diversity language. In the proposed amendment, the maps could end up in the Supreme Court, where judges are appointed according to partisan politics. Why should voters consider passing the proposed constitutional amendment as opposed to the approach that Delegate Price recommends? We'll go ahead and start with Mr. Vassar on that one.
Yeah, I think that's the exact point. it is legislatively controlled, which is as long as the no constitutional amendment passes, I don't care what the intentions are, the legislature controls what happens. And I know Democrats feel strong and certain, and I have lots of faith and confidence in them. But after 32 years of working with the Congress and the Virginia legislature, I know that these intentions, while they're great and they're going to work hard to bring them about, isn't automatic. So the notion that we're going to just walk in there and do exactly what we want and nobody's going to have anything to say about it because that's what we want is selling a lot that I'm leery of in terms of the notion of how we can do these things. You know, as Kathay pointed out, we've had legislative control for a long time. We've known for a long time that these were things that were desired and needed. And we've had Democratic majorities in legislatures, and we haven't seen that. We've had the bills that were designed to accomplish these things that haven't passed, even with Democratic control of the legislature. So I'm just not understanding why there's so much confidence that if we get rid of what we worked hard to get to this point and start all over, we'll get something great then. I just think that it puts too much aspiration into an important issue that is moving along, that's not going to wait for everybody to get everything just right and perfect, even if they could. We're going to have to redistrict for 2021. And it's either going to be legislatively controlled, and I put big emphasis on that word because no matter what you say you can do, if it's controlled by the legislature, not only does it not have to go that way, but even if it did under Democrats this year, as soon as the legislative majority changes, which can happen as we've seen, then that no longer prevails. So we have this great chance now to take this issue out of the legislature, which is the only way we can get rid of partisan control. And I put partisan control, not that there's partisan. Bipartisan isn't partisan control. And so if we want to get rid of partisan control redistricting, this is our chance. This is the one chance we have for the next 10 years to have this impact on redistricting, because it's going to happen, and it's either under legislative control or this mechanism that the amendment proposes.
Thank you, Mr. Vassar. Delegate Levine or Mr. Levasseur, do you have any responses to that?
Yes, so I think Bobby Vassar and Kathay Feng, and I have great respect for both of them, look at this issue nationally and think of it nationally. And they say, well, in California or in, I don't know, Missouri or Maryland, they did this, that, or the other. We can't trust them. At the end of the day, it all comes down to who you trust. I don't trust a partisan Supreme Court chosen by partisan Republicans, including ex-Republican delegates, including a sister of a Republican senator, including Ken Cuccinelli's right-hand man. I don't trust them. I trust my colleagues who passed in the House an independent commission far better than this constitutional amendment. We're on record. We're going to vote for it again next year. I'll introduce it. Delegate Price will introduce it. It will pass. We have the votes. So this is a false choice, this idea that pass this or we gerrymander. Actually, if you pass it, that's the clearest way to get a gerrymander. Because if you pass it, then you put in the Constitution, the Supreme Court has absolute power, unappealable absolute power to do anything but racial gerrymandering. That they can't do under federal law. Everything else they can do. You know, Ken Cuccinelli can write the maps and his guy can put it forward. And, you know, the idea that, oh, we'll pass legislation and we'll get Justice Chafin to recuse herself and not help her brother, Senator Chafin. Well, we can't do that because the Constitution says Supreme Court establishes the districts. So if the Supreme Court establishes the districts, that's the Constitution, and the law says this justice can't do it, well, you have a conflict between the law and the Constitution. And the Constitution says they all can do it. The Supreme Court, is she on the Supreme Court? Yes. Can she design her brother's district? Yes. The law says she can't, doesn't matter. Constitution trumps the law. What if we don't like it? What can we do about it? Nothing, because the Supreme Court will design our districts. We won't be in the majority anymore. She'll put her brother in the majority, and her brother will put her back on the court. And there's nothing we can do about it. We could have 60, 65% voting for Democrats. But as you know, with the proper Republican gerrymander, we will never be in control of Virginia again. So this idea that it's a bird in the hand, this bird is a Republican partisan gerrymander. Voting for this amendment ensures a Republican partisan gerrymander unless all these Republicans on the Supreme Court decide to ignore their past history and decide to actually be fair. That's possible. It's also possible that your Democrats, the ones you elected, will do what we promised to do all along. And this idea that you can't trust any Democrats because somewhere in California or Missouri, Democrats did the wrong thing, or in Maryland, but you must trust the Republicans because we all know Virginia Republicans are stalwart people. I just don't think that that's our experience. And yeah, it does come down to who you trust. And if you trust Democrats, you need to vote no, and then we can do it right in time. By the way, we don't have to do it constitutionally. We can pass it in the legislature in 2021, the independent commission that all of us voted for, whether it's my bill or Delegate Price's bill or some combination or the California plan, we can do it next year in time and get a constitutional amendment in time for 2031.
Thank you, Delegate Levine. Ms. Feng, do you have a chance to answer the question?
Sure. I mean, if you could do it through the legislature, then why didn't you do it in 2020?
Because Republicans opposed it. And they wouldn't oppose it.
So then it's still a bird in the bush, period.
Yeah.
No, because Republicans won't support a Democratic gerrymander, you see. So they'll have no choice without the amendment.
Okay. I mean, you know, if it could happen, great. But I think that's just the reality is like people are going to have something on the ballot in November. And it does create a system of checks and balances. And I think that it's something that, you know, for Virginia, it moves us strides forward. And I compare it to other states because there are plenty of states that have passed things that are horrible, right? And in my mind, you know, what this is it isn't what California created, but at the same time, it isn't the worst thing. And in fact, it creates a lot of protections that give people the ability to pursue protections for minority voting rights that didn't exist before. I get it that it feels like you don't know and you're not sure how it will turn out because it isn't the California Commission. At the same time, I think that it creates an open process where written into law, it's required to have open hearings and it's required to have a level of transparency that doesn't exist right now. And it is that kind of transparency and that kind of public participation when people come to it, they come and talk about their communities, they feel heard, and it's reflected back to them in the maps that are ultimately drawn. You create a relationship with people who are constituents that reminds them the good that government can do. And I guess I'll just end on that, which is I think that what Democrats generally all agree on, and even though I wear a nonpartisan hat, you can see my colors showing, right? Which is, I think we all believe that you can create government that is responsive to people, that will take into consideration what our viewpoints are, and ultimately where we elect people who listen to us and not special interests or party interests. It's hard. It's hard to say that the thing that is going onto the ballot because it is. And I guess what I would say is that's what the Arlington Democratic Club is going to have to figure out.
Thank you.
And sometimes what I'll say is that when you've been in the desert for a long time without water, a sip is really tasty and quenching.
Thank you, Ms. Feng. Mr. Levasseur, do you have one final thought on that question before we move to closing remarks?
Well, just that what appears to be water can also be something pretty unpleasant. You know, if you've been in the desert, sometimes if somebody hands you a cup of arsenic, you don't really want to drink it. So this is a problem. This isn't something that's going to be quenching and refreshing. This is going to be something that, as Mark has pointed out, very vociferously for quite a while, is a gigantic, it can be a real problem. It could work out. It could. I mean, I don't dispute that. Everything could, we could trust the Republicans in the commission. We could trust the Republicans in the Supreme Court. Everything could work out great. It could be a complete disaster. And it could be, gerrymandering. It could lock in gerrymandering, and we shouldn't take the position. We made a bad deal in 2019. And as Delegate Scott said, when it came up for reconsideration in 2020, we should have made a different decision in Richmond. And the voters should not accept this because it's not a good commission.
Thank you, Mr. Levasseur. And now we're moving to the closing remarks portion of our statement. Before we get to that, we'd just like to recognize that Caucus has joined us this evening. He's actually been here during the duration of this call. Caucus is the democratically endorsed candidate for the Arlington County Board in the upcoming special election on July 7th. We remind everyone to request their absentee ballot by June 30th. Thank you for joining us, Caucus. Thank you to all the panelists for that rich dialogue tonight. It's been great watching both viewpoints make their points. It's now time for closing remarks. Each panelist will be given 2 minutes to issue final remarks to our viewers. We will start in reverse order of the opening statements. So that begins with Mr. Levasseur.
Well, I sort of just made my closing, but I'll just say, I guess I don't think that the arsenic reference was proper, but just from a quick scan of the Google. But the problem that we have is in 2019, there'd been a lot of pressure for an amendment to fix gerrymandering, and there was a deal was made because that was the view was it was the best that they could do at the time with the Republican-controlled legislature, and that may be true. I'm not going to go back and second guess that. The problem is when we had control in 2020, we needed to rethink what we were doing, and and the problem is that we didn't do that, and we accepted an amendment that just has these flawed structures in it, and and we can't allow ourselves to be drawn in out of fear of either the Washington Post criticizing us, the Democrats, or for whatever reason. We need to stand up and push people and encourage people to vote against this amendment, because it is not the way that we need to do redistricting. We need an independent commission. We need a structure that can actually deliver, have a better chance of delivering fair, non-gerrymandered lines, and moving the power from a partisan legislature into a partisan commission is not the way to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Levasseur. Ms. Feng, we have you up next.
Yeah, I think that it is important for people to think hard about the fight to end gerrymandering around the country, the principles that Democrats stand for, and how important this is for Virginia today. If we pass this amendment on the November ballot, it will mean that we are enshrining into the state constitution protections for minority groups that do not exist right now. It means that if the commission or any map that is drawn steps out of line, that you have a basis for challenging it and protecting minority voting rights. I'm sorry that Delegate Scott has stepped off, because what I wanted to say was, I think that there are a lot of things that are important for us to remember about advancing civil rights in this country. It's why 2 legislative Black Caucus senators actually sponsored the constitutional amendment on the Senate side. And I would just want to remind folks that in the end, Eric Holder and the National Redistricting Foundation supported this constitutional amendment, because they took a look at it and they said, whatever you really, really want in Virginia, this thing, at least it protects minority voting rights and it gives citizens a chance to be at the table. And that's all we're saying. It's better than the politicians drawing the lines. It creates an alternative. It's the only thing that we've got on November's ballot in time for the 2021 redistricting.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Feng. Next, we had Mr. Scott, but he unfortunately had to drop off, and so did Senator Favola. But speaking in Senator Favola's place is Krista Rosa.
I know. I think Mr. Vassar is taking her 2 minutes.
You are still welcome to give some closing remarks.
Okay, but let me think about it. Let me go ahead and let Mr. Vassar.
That's
Okay.
fine. We'll switch up if that's okay, and she can then take my remarks.
Okay.
Or take the remarks at a different time. I still want to say.
Well,
my point.
go just to be fair and going in order, Delegate Levine is actually next, and then we'll come back to you,
Oh,
Mr.
sorry.
Vassar.
Okay, and if Delegate Scott doesn't come back, I certainly can speak 4 minutes on this. So I am the founder of the Virginia Transparency Caucus. I'm all about transparency. I love transparency. Those of you who are my constituents know I have Mark's monthly meetup once a month. I've had it for 5 years. I'm the guy who brought cameras into the Virginia General Assembly in our committee rooms. They were never there before. That was my initiative. I love transparency. Here's the problem. The commission may be transparent, but if Todd Gilbert says no, it goes in the toilet. And then the Supreme Court decides with no transparency, no citizen involvement, none. They decide to help out their friends, the ones who chose them to be there, and there's no transparency. They don't even have to write an opinion. It says shall establish the districts. Now they probably will write an opinion. I don't know, they're not required to. But if you believe in transparency, you should want a nonpartisan independent commission, the one that we Democrats are on record as supporting, and we can do in 2021 in time. It's true that we ate from the rotten orchard. That's actually, I'm using a lot of metaphors tonight, but that's one I used with the newspapers. They killed all our other apples, right? We've been trying to end gerrymandering in Virginia long before I was in office. There's decades and decades of Democratic proposals to have independent commissions. And who killed them? The Republicans, every single time. Mark Cole, Todd Gilbert, the people with the amendment trust so much to do the right thing, they consistently oppose anything to stop Republican gerrymandering. And they did incredible gerrymandering. They even did racial gerrymandering, which, as you know, the federal courts found to be illegal. So we tried to do all the good apples. In 2019, there were several really good bills. One, Virginia 2021, had a good bill with an independent commission. Republicans killed it. George Barker's original bill was a good bill. Republicans killed it. We were given one apple, one rotten apple, Mark Cole's proposal, let the Virginia Supreme Court decide, and we ate it. Yeah, it was the only apple out there. But we can do better if the amendment goes down. We can put in a full orchard. And I know there's some folks that say, we can't trust Democrats. You know, y'all are Democrats. The idea that you're going to trust Todd Gilbert and Mark Cole over us, okay, fine, there's some Democrats maybe you don't trust. But let me explain the politics of it. The Republicans think they're going to get a pure Republican gerrymander. So every single Republican in the Commonwealth of Virginia supports this amendment. But once the amendment fails, they won't have that power. Now they've got to negotiate with us. Now, Kathay Feng says, well, you know, if you don't vote for the amendment, you get pure Democratic gerrymander. But here's the thing, Republicans don't want pure Democratic gerrymander. They're gonna have to work with us and finally have a bipartisan independent commission, exactly what we've been proposing for 30 years. What we're on the record as supporting, they're not on the record supporting. They have to take that because that's better than a Democratic gerrymander. So by defeating this amendment, you push the Republicans and Democrats to actually give the perfect solution, the better solution, either the California solution or independent commission solution. Don't vote for this amendment because you think it's better than gerrymandering, because we're on record as opposing gerrymandering. The amendment itself is flawed. And I know folks like to trust judges. I used to until Bush v. Gore, but once they shut down an election in Florida, I recognize that judges are just people in robes. And last, I just want to say this. I know I have a lot of passion on this, and I apologize if I'm showing a little too much passion here. I really fear the alternative. I know what we can do in the House. I know what can be done in the Senate. I don't know what will be done. I have no idea what will be done if Todd Gilbert and Mark Cole and the Republican appointed justices do their thing with no safeguards. I don't know what they're going to do. I hope they do the right thing. But if they don't, it's disastrous, because any racial protections out the window, right? I don't believe a law can trump the Constitution. But if it could, Republicans can change it, and they'll be in control for decades to come if they get a nice Republican gerrymander the way they think they're going to do it. See, Todd Gilbert says he thinks that this amendment will give them full power. He thinks so. I think so. And a lot of really good government people, good Democrats, friends of mine, they want to believe strongly that we're going to have this wonderful system and people will do the right thing and people will act ethically. You know, I don't know. Maybe I've been around Trump and Scalia.
Delegate Levine,
Yeah.
that was your full 4 minutes, including Delegate
All right, I
Scott's
took my
time.
full 4 minutes. That's fine. Thank you.
Appreciate the passion, though. And next, we'll move to Mr. Vassar.
Thank you, and I appreciate this forum and the opportunity to speak on these important issues. Speaking of trusting Democrats, I worked with a lot of great Democrats on putting together and promoting and helping to pass this amendment that's before us. These are not people who are seeking to support Republicans in their goals or initiatives. These are people who sat down and wrote because they had the control and they were able to determine what language went into these amendments because Democrats were in the majority in terms of whether to pass this amendment or not. So they are people that I work with and that I trust to help come up with what they consider to be a good product out of a legislative process where you can never be sure of how things will go. I love Delegate Levine's and others' confidence that Democrats will do the right thing and get everybody to go along with them, House, Senate, everywhere else that they need support. But I'm not sure that that's how it works. I believe that we have a good product that, as anything, can certainly be improved with legislative supports, as any constitutional amendment should be and has to be. But I think we run a big risk of letting the search for a more perfect amendment be the enemy of a good amendment that brings about a good process that includes citizens, that protects minorities, that has transparency, that prevents some of the back and forth that's going to happen when we get into the process of the next 10 years, regardless of how anybody wants to look at it, where the legislature will still control the process. So no matter what bill is passed in this upcoming legislature, it could totally be changed the next year or anytime thereafter if there's not a constitutional amendment that controls the process. And the notion that it's just going to be adopted because this is what good and earnest people want to see done, I think is not my experience of 32 years of working with the state and federal legislators. I think we have a good amendment, and the only opportunity to do something that I've certainly seen as an objective that's where they're being worked for, and that is to wrest control of the redistricting process from the legislature. If we don't do it now, it will not be done for, in terms of having an impact on redistricting for another 10 years, because that's the redistricting cycle. So we have a good amendment that I believe is worthy of support of the citizens of Virginia. And I hope that they will put this in place in order to make a huge step in the direction of cleaning up and making better the legislative district drawing process in Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Vassar. Chris, do you have any final comments before we wrap up the program?
Sure. Let's start the video. Yeah, if I could, because I wasn't giving us a chance to respond to the question about C.O. Price's bill, 1256. That had an advisory commission, and it was interesting that when it was finally amended, and it didn't make it out of the General Assembly, but her final commission looked exactly like the commission that's in the constitutional amendment, with 8 legislators and 8 citizens. It was only an advisory commission, so I'm not sure how much weight an advisory commission would hold. And if for some reason there were no maps agreed to, the final decision on drawing the maps would go back to the General Assembly, which is not what we really want to have happen. So, you know, that is one of the reasons that 1256 was not a great bill. And I know Delegate Levine says he has proposed some bills or constitutional amendment. I don't believe either of them passed out of the House. I'm not sure why, but perhaps you could ask him later. So I'll just repeat very quickly. I think this is a good bill. I think it will give citizens finally a place at the table. I don't like the comments that were said suggesting that citizens would be walked all over by the legislators. We have excellent citizens out there who are probably experts about redistricting and can use computer programs to assist them when they get the data from the census, et cetera. That wouldn't be me, but I know there are people out there, and to suggest that they would not be effective members of the commission is an insult to the rest of us. Again, I think the transparency piece is very important. We need to keep an eye open and watch what happens. And I think the protections in the Constitution for racial and ethnic minorities and minority language groups is very important to have. So I hope people will consider that. And if you need to, you can contact delegates such as Dan Helmer, who voted for it. Ask him why he supported it. Delegate Sam Rasool is another Democrat that we have supported in the past. You can ask him for his opinion too. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chris. And on behalf of all the Arlington Democrats, I'd like to thank all the speakers and panelists tonight for their participation on this important subject. At the end of the day, we're all Democrats, and we appreciate the rich discussion tonight. I would also like to thank all of our viewers for staying with us for this entire event. We'd finally like to take a moment to thank Chris DeRosa for her efforts in creating the introductory slides at the start of the program. Thank you very much, Chris. Our speakers have provided additional resources that we will circulate after this meeting. Many of you have also asked for the slide deck. We'd like to remind our viewers that tonight's roundtable was recorded and will be available for future viewing. We will email the slide deck to participants following the discussion. Please check your email for those materials. Stay on the lookout for some of these speakers in an upcoming morning mug session, which is the Arl Dems informal coffee hour that occurs on Saturday mornings. On behalf of all of us, stay safe, stay well, and don't forget to vote in November. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I'm trying to figure out how to save the chats because I want to read them. Does anyone know how?
I think we were just talking about that. I don't think you can.
Oh, that's too bad. I hope someone can. If
Yes,
not,
you can save it to a file in the lower right.
this file. What do I do?
Oh,
Your computer? I hit your computer and I don't know what to do. Maybe I just pick a folder? I don't know.
Well, say save it to your computer and then your folder box comes up.
Oh, wait, I think I just posted something there. I didn't mean to do that. Oops. I hope that wasn't important. What was that? I don't know what that was. Okay, I did that exactly. Files for uploading a file.
Oh my God, we haven't gotten her yet? We have to get her, yeah.
How do we
Thank
save?
you.
I'm hoping someone tells us how to save it because I would like to save. I want to read it. I wasn't able to read all the comments.
Mark,
Yes.
you made a great point about Fairfax County. I should have said something about that.
Yeah, we should have pointed out that
We did vote it down.
County
Fairfax
opposes
County
it,
voted it down.
and so did the state party, and so does Terry McAuliffe, and so does Susan Swecker, and I probably should have mentioned that.
Yeah, we should have said that. I should have thought of it. Oh yeah.
All of them have opposed it, and I think the state party is going to come out strongly against it. All right, I guess I have to take a look.
Is it going to be on the? Is it going to be on the amendment though? I've seen what the amendment look like the question, but the question is terrible. It's like it gives you. It's like, do you want it to pass or do you not? You know what I mean? It's like, do you want gerrymandering or do you not? You know, it doesn't, can't we give some kind of explanation?
Well, I think there is some kind of, there is a resolution